Welcome to UT Health San Antonio Wellbeing Wisdom Podcast, a dose of learning for healthier, happier lives, brought to you by the Office of Human Resources. With Memorial Day on the horizon, it is the time of year many of us pause to honor our fallen heroes. We're grateful to our service members and first responders who have sacrificed their lives for our freedom and safety. Likewise, we understand that losing a beloved family member, friend, colleague, and even a pet or job is among our most universal and painful human experiences. Yet it tends to be the least talked about in the workplace. Because we are human beings first, even when working, grief has the potential to overwhelm us, sometimes unpredictably. American novelist Joan Didion said it best: grief, when it comes, is nothing we expect it to be. Grief has no distance. Grief comes in waves, paroxysms, sudden apprehensions that weaken the knees and blind the eyes and obliterate the dailiness of life. I am your host, Laura Gottlieb, and our topic today is coping with grief and loss, honoring our fallen heroes and loved ones. We are joined by two very special guests. Welcome, UT Health Student Counseling Center licensed clinical psychologist, Dr. Liza Maldonado, and licensed clinical social worker and UT Employee Assistance Program representative, Delphi Medina. Thank you for joining us, and welcome to you both.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Thank you. Happy to be here as well.
Discussing death and dying and even aging tends to be relatively taboo in our society. So it's no wonder it's difficult talking openly about grief and loss, especially at work. Dr. Maldonado, please share with us a little about your background and interest in this topic, and what is grief? How is it experienced?
I think I'll start with talking about what grief is, and then I'll go into my particular interest in this topic. So, grief is a process of making sense of a big change or loss in our lives. The mind-body just wants to understand, and grief is the process of coming to an understanding that feels safe or safe enough and allows us to move forward with our lives. Not without our loved one who has passed, but carrying their memory with us into the rest of our lives. And you're absolutely right that talking about death and dying has become taboo in our society. But it actually wasn't always this way. In the United States, prior to the 20th century, people used to die in their homes, and family members were very much involved in preparing the bodies for burial. Over time, as dying moved out of the home and out of the care of the immediate family, death as a concept also moved out of mind for the average person. And this is when it became taboo in our American culture. And it became labeled as morbid or something to be feared rather than discussed. In thinking about this, though, we have to remember that the population of the United States is about 13% immigrants. And the two largest groups of immigrants are from Mexico and India. Interestingly, both of these countries, generally speaking, approach death with much less avoidance than is common in more traditional American homes. And their rituals typically involve more closeness with the body of the deceased and a longer, more structured initial period of mourning that includes a lot more connection with extended family, friends, and acquaintances. And this brings me to your question about my interest in this topic. The truth is, I never really paid much attention to death and dying rituals until I had the privilege of witnessing what my family calls a good death. My paternal grandfather, who played a monumental role in my life, throughout my growing up years, decided he was ready to die at age 97. His kidneys were failing him, and after talking it over with my aunt, who was a registered nurse, now retired, he decided to go home to die rather than begin dialysis. He called his loved ones to his side, and we came, over 50 of us, from 5 different states to accompany him. We took turns keeping him company as he delivered many pithy stories and jokes about his life over the span of several days until he could barely speak. While he could still eat, he asked for 3 of his favorite foods, and we brought them to him. Some of them were fairly difficult to find, but we did. He asked for specific friends, and they came. One of them brought a harmonica and played it as we sang one of his favorite songs, and then another and another. He kept us updated on his progress along his death journey so that we wouldn't be afraid. There was very little fear, very little uncertainty. In the end, he muttered, "Estoy listo, montado y armado," which translates to, "I'm ready, mounted, and armed," meaning I'm ready for whatever comes next in this journey. It was a beautiful experience, and though we didn't know it then, he prepared us all for his own death over the course of those sad and beautiful days. After this experience, I became fascinated by the way people die and how this affects their loved one's bereavement. And I have since had the privilege of witnessing bereavement in hundreds of military veterans. I learned that whether it's a World War II veteran who flew 26 missions over Japan or an Iraq War veteran who hunted down terrorists, the goal of their grieving was always the same. And that was to reach an understanding of the loss that allowed them to move forward into the rest of their lives. But while the goal was the same, the way they reached that understanding was incredibly nuanced and personal. The most important message I want to convey today is that the stages that we have to explain grieving may or may not fit your experience, and that this is okay. We as a collective humanity have to give each other permission around that so that we can really present ourselves as supportive and safe. Because the alternative is to make it unsafe by having an expectation around what our own or someone else's grief journey should be. It's important for communities to throw away their expectations around what they think grief is and to turn toward creating safe spaces to allow individuals to find their own understanding about what has transpired.
Dr. Maldonado, I am truly moved by everything you just shared, everything from the avoidance that we often face and feel, how our approach to death and dying has changed over time. And I loved your words, a good death, and how you described, this individual experience of reaching an understanding and making meaning. So appreciate you taking your personal experience and engaging in this work. It's so needed. And as we approach Memorial Day, it's top of mind for many of us. I'm wondering if you could describe for us and our listeners some of the phases of grief and loss, what one could expect. I'm also curious about the role of ritual in honoring our fallen heroes and loved ones. What are some ways we can truly honor our loved ones?
Sure, I'm happy to address those questions. The original 5-stage model of grief was created by Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross in 1969, based on her work with terminally ill patients. And the stages in that early model were denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Since then, many new models have been created, but most scholars do agree that some version of the original 5 stages yields the most robust understanding of the bereavement process. In other words, we haven't done much better than Dr. Kubler-Ross since 1969. She pretty much hit it spot on with her understanding of death and dying. Today, I'll briefly go through a 7-stage model that has received a good deal of support recently. And as I'm talking about it, I'm going to be applying the model to the death of a loved one, but the model can be applied to other losses, such as divorce, loss of a job, or loss of health. But I'm just going to be focusing my examples on the death of a loved one for now. So the first stage in this model is shock and denial. And it might occur when we're trying to process a loss that seems unimaginable and feels unacceptable. Then denial is the defense mechanism that helps us cope with the loss by giving us some time to understand what has just happened and slowly adjust to the change. Some feelings that might accompany the shock and denial phase are depression, hopelessness, confusion, loneliness, and even anger. This actually is one of the most challenging stages because in this stage, people tend to isolate themselves. We have to be reminded sometimes about self-care or remind others who are grieving around us. And if the inability to function remains persistent, the grieving person might benefit from professional help. The second stage of grief in this model is pain and guilt. In this stage, the grieving person realizes that a loved one is gone. People regret the outcome and hold unrealistic expectations about what they could have done to stop the loss. And some common feelings here might be blame, sadness, guilt, or regret. The challenge in this stage is that people tend to ruminate about perceived mistakes. They might start engaging in very negative self-talk, which then increases their suffering and perpetuates guilt. Outside intervention from a mental health professional may help if the self-talk continues. The third stage is anger and bargaining. Sources of anger at this stage might include anger at being abandoned by the loved one, anger at the extent of the pain, anger that life has changed, anger that managing grief feels difficult, or anger that the world suddenly feels different, empty, or unsafe. In addition to anger in this stage, there's often bargaining as the grieving person tries to regain a false sense of control because they feel helpless. And feelings that might accompany this stage include frustration, resentment, rage, false hope, anxiety, specifically anxiety paired with anger, and also fear. A concern here is that people in this stage may isolate themselves, or they might lose social support because of unchecked anger. Also, their bargaining with God or others may delay acceptance. But thankfully, this phase generally doesn't last very long. It doesn't last as long as the others, because most people will realize fairly quickly that what they hope for cannot happen. The fourth stage of grief in this model is depression. It occurs when time has passed and the ramifications of a loss become clearer. This stage can look like less concentration, inability to sleep, or sleeping too much. There may be physical symptoms like headaches and body aches or digestive issues. And some common feelings here might be loneliness, sadness, depression, emptiness, anhedonia, or the inability to feel joy. There might be self-pity. And you're probably thinking, this stage does look a lot like clinical depression. And the reality is, it may be difficult to differentiate from clinical depression. People who have very little social support, who tend to isolate themselves, or those that have a predisposition for depression are at greater risk of developing major depressive disorder during bereavement, and this stage in particular. And it's important to remember that both grief and depression can overlap. Unfortunately, this stage can be the longest of grief. And if the grieving person is depressed almost all the time and their symptoms don't fluctuate, it may be time to reach out to a mental health professional. The fifth stage of grief in this model is the upward turn. And this is when people really start to feel a healing process begin to unfold. They begin to adjust to life after the loss. They start to see that they've survived the loss and they have a future to live. Typically, depressive symptoms and physical symptoms of grief begin to lessen here. Feelings that might accompany this stage might be hope, moments of happiness, feeling a sense of well-being, and even periods of feeling calm. This stage offers relief and a sense of hope that a grieving person can build a new life after an enormous loss. Another fairly positive stage is reconstruction and working through. In this stage, people have more energy and a new desire to begin to move forward by finding meaning and growth after a loss. Feelings that might accompany this stage include energy, optimism, feeling more at peace, hopefulness, and maybe more confidence. So here people start asking, what actions do I need to take to build a new life for myself? It's a time to redefine what everyday life will look like now. People might start exercising again, spending more time with family and friends, and sort of coming out of their bereavement shell. The seventh stage of grief is acceptance and hope. This is when we permit ourselves to plan for a future, knowing that we'll never forget what has happened. There still is pain and sadness, but we recognize that it's okay for us to move forward and keep living. Some feelings in this stage might include relief, optimism, reflection, acceptance, and more hope. Though at this stage, we may not have fully healed from our loss, we can have renewed strength and determination to move forward. There may still be feelings of sadness that arise at holidays or birthdays, but these anniversaries don't cause the level of despair that was experienced in the earlier stages of grief. Coming back to your question about the role of ritual on Memorial Day. This Memorial Day, I think if you want to honor your lost loved ones or our nation's heroes in general, the first part is understanding the impact of this type of death on a family, whether it's your own family or another family. To understand the suffering of a military family who has lost a service member, we have to first understand the impact of change and uncertainty on their lives. In general, we humans do not do well with change or uncertainty. In military families, the stress of uncertainty, unfortunately, begins as soon as a family member or members enlist or commission. You might have heard the phrase, families serve too. This comes from the reality that military families, along with the service member, experience multiple relocations, job transitions, and separations, including deployments. Deployments can vary in terms of risk, duration, and purpose, but for families, they always involve a cycle of separation, which disrupts the stability of relationships and routines. So when a death occurs in this context, it happens in an already stressed system. And this increases the risk of dysfunctional grief. And dysfunctional grief is essentially grief that impairs functioning and lasts longer than is expected based on cultural norms. Risk factors for dysfunctional grief include many factors that are common across military families. These include social isolation, the suddenness of the death, insecure attachment or anxious attachment, a spiritual struggle with the death, an inability to make sense of the loss, as is common when the service member is very young, socioeconomic disadvantage, and decreased institutional and informational support. In reviewing these risk factors, you can probably imagine how the nature of a military hero's death might increase the risk of dysfunctional grief in their family members. So the question was, what is the role of ritual in honoring our fallen heroes and loved ones? I would have to say that the role of ritual is to understand, to go through a process of meaning making or making sense of what has happened in order to move toward what is called integrated grief. With integrated grief, the finality of death is acknowledged. There are bittersweet emotions, but they are accessible and they're changing, meaning the person might be able to experience joy in remembering the lost loved one. The mental representation of the deceased is being revised in integrated grief. The person is able to remember their loved one with a diverse set of memories instead of focusing on the story of the loss. With integrated grief, a coherent narrative of the loss is being formulated. In other words, there is an understanding of what has occurred and an acceptance. With integrated grief, life goals are being redefined, meaning the loved ones are remembered and they are honored by the family members taking their memory, learning from it, and bringing the loved one with them into their lives by incorporating them into their goals for the future. You asked about some specific ways that we can truly honor our loved ones. There are many ways to honor military service members who we've lost. One of them is to display our flag. The U.S. flag is flown at half staff from dawn until noon on Memorial Day. Some people also fly the POW MIA flag to honor prisoners of war and those missing in action. Another way is to visit a cemetery. You can honor a family member or any veteran by placing flowers on their grave. Here in San Antonio, you might visit San Antonio National Cemetery or Fort Sam Houston National Cemetery. Another way to honor fallen heroes is to join the national moment of silence. Pause wherever you are at 3 p.m. on Memorial Day for a moment of silence to remember and honor those who died serving our country. You can also attend a local parade. Many cities and towns have Memorial Day parades. I know San Antonio has in the past and might do it again. I don't know if they've had it in a while since, post-COVID. But you can always find that information on city websites and just by searching on Google. You can also contact your military and family support center to find a local event. Another way to honor our heroes on Memorial Day is to wear red poppies. People often wear red poppies on this day to honor those who have died serving our nation during war. I also encourage everyone listening to create your own ritual. If you lost a beloved service member, come up with a way to honor him or her in a personal way. Watch their favorite movie, listen to their favorite song, cook their favorite meal, or get the family together to view a photo slideshow. The key is to make the most of whatever ritual you choose by allowing yourself to feel your emotions, talking to others, writing about what you are experiencing, and considering ways of moving forward through your life with the knowledge that this person existed and will continue to influence your life as you move forward with them, with their memory in tow, and benefiting you throughout the rest of your life.
Thank you, Dr. Maldonado, walking us through the 7 stages of grief and also giving us some really solid examples on how we can honor our fallen heroes and loved ones. And I would imagine that, some of your suggestions could be for those outside of the military and perhaps even incorporated in other types of grief. And that leads me really to my next question, Delphi, and we heard Dr. Maldonado touch on it in terms of grief can extend beyond the loss of a loved one, include things like loss of a job, loss of a pet. And I'm wondering if you could expand on that for us, Delphi, and talk about the different types of grief that we might experience.
Yes, thank you. Well, there are different types of grief, and it doesn't always necessarily mean death. And like Dr. Maldonado said, it could be loss of a job, especially when you've been a long-term employee and maybe it's due to layoff and it was unexpected. Pets are like our family, and so that's especially hard on people when you've had a pet for double-digit years and they are a member of the family. Other types of loss that we would like to suggest that you may have this grief process with is breakups in relationships or friendships for that matter. You may have a falling out with your best friend for 15 years and all of a sudden that friendship is over. You may be in a long-term relationship and maybe never married and lived together for a long period of time, and that relationship is over. Let's say you got married and it ends in divorce. All of these are different types of grief that you'll experience. Something that a lot of people probably don't think about when it comes to grief. For example, I live in Houston. We have lots of natural disasters. We have lots of hurricanes, we have lots of tornadoes, and we especially have a lot of flooding in Houston. And sometimes people lose houses. And when we had the ongoing hurricanes and tropical storms with flooding, and they just finished recuperating from the hurricane, and then a flood came, they're still dealing with the damages to their house or having to move, and they can't be in their house because you can't live in it. Those are all examples of grief. Losing loss of freedom, which we experienced during the pandemic. We weren't allowed to go for a while to the movie theater, to restaurants, until they went up to specifications for a certain amount of people at the same time and spacing. We weren't used to that. So that brought on a lot of grief of how we lived in society and how that's changed from then to now. So these are all different examples of different types of losses where you will experience grief and it's not necessarily death.
I appreciate that. And especially touching on recent experiences that we've all shared, the loss of freedom associated with COVID and expanding on that definition. I have gone through loss, as I'm sure many of our listeners have, and I know that it shook me to the core. And Delphi, I'm wondering if you can share how grief affects one's ability to perform at work, and also what would be helpful in terms of support from leaders and teams, and how they can help a colleague through a difficult time.
Well, as Dr. Maldonado shared a personal experience, I will do the same. I recently just lost my mother on March 21st of this year due to a car accident. It came out of the blue. And I will touch on the point about compassionate leadership and supportive leadership. My team was incredibly supportive during that time. Obviously, you know, through our state of Texas, we have the bereavement leave with just 3 days, but we have that. And obviously, I have some time, and they were very supportive. They, you know, for some people, it's meal trains because you're not thinking of eating or you're not wanting to eating, and people just automatically, that's kind of like etiquette or a ritual to bring food when someone dies. So food's delivered. I think in regards to work, it was, you know, when I'm ready to return, you know, there may be some days that you're not feel like wanting to do direct services. Let us know. We have people who will go, because I'm currently off site, to be in my absence if I don't feel like going because I'm feeling the grief of the loss of my mom. Being flexible. For this instance, my boss was willing to do this podcast because he thought this may be edgy for me to do right now. But normally when I do my best work is when I'm going through personal struggles. And so I was like, no, I can do it, and it's my responsibility to do it. But he's offering that. You know, sending flowers, especially again during Easter, knowing that was the first holiday without my mother. You know, people checking on me, letting me know that they're thinking of me. My coworkers and my bosses and my HR colleagues that are in HR from UT Health Houston. So just being able just to be flexible, understanding that you're going to have some good days and you're going to have not so good days. Having that flexibility and support is most important during this time. How it intervenes at work is that sometimes, you know, you may be caught thinking about something else. So you may not be as focused during that time. So it's important to be able to have some accountability, like go into therapy on your own or asking people to check in with you, making sure that you're getting your deadlines done for certain projects or dates that you have assignments due or podcasts to record or to be on site somewhere. Making sure that you're eating and you're sleeping enough so that you're not so fatigued when you're at work and that you're being able to focus and being able to take some time during the day if you're not focused enough to be able to go take a walk down the hall or go outside and ground yourself, get some sun on you to get back to your desk and do what you need to do on the computer for reports or for emails or taking calls, because we get a lot of crisis calls in the EAP office. So, and being able to ask for help and knowing that your leaders have that open door policy, especially knowing if you shared personal stuff like this, that they're willing to work with you. I think that's what compassionate leadership is about. It bodes well for a positive environment, especially during these challenging times.
Thank you, Delphi. And I'm so sorry for your loss. I appreciate you being open and sharing your experience. It's meaningful and serves as inspiration for us to be human with each other in the workplace and how critical that is. And one thing you mentioned that really struck me is this idea of asking for help and even asking for people to check on you. it comes to mind, especially as we think about how isolated we all became during COVID. And some of our social structures have been rebuilt since then. Some of them haven't, or at least not in the same way. And so, Dr. Maldonado, I'm wondering what you recommend as effective ways to cope with grief and loss, and how we can incorporate social support as well. I'm wondering, how long is this healing journey?
Sure, I'm happy to talk about that. I also want to extend my condolences to Delphi. Thank you so much for sharing your example. And it sounds like you have a very supportive work environment. It's great to see examples like that. So I think the first question, what are some effective ways to cope with grief and loss? And I think the most effective way to facilitate natural, healthy grieving is to talk about the loss that has happened. And I want to share with you the recommendations of Robert Niemeyer, who is Professor Emeritus of the Department of Psychology at the University of Memphis. He's published over 500 articles and chapters and 30 books, including Routledge's series on techniques of grief therapy. So he's definitely one of the world's leading experts on this topic. And he explains that the goal of the bereaved is to move from acute grief processes towards what he calls integrated grief. And I've already discussed that a little bit earlier. But he writes a lot about these two distinct acute grief processes. And the first one is processing the event story of the death itself and understanding its implications in our ongoing life. So here in this process, we're asking what just happened and how did it happen? And it might seem like a very basic process, but it isn't. It can take us, I can tell you, from my work in sessions with my clients, it can take us weeks, sometimes even months, to construct this event story. And it can go better if we are talking to others about it. You asked about how do we incorporate support from others, and this is a very important way that we can incorporate our loved ones, friends and family members who can listen to us as we attempt to construct a cohesive narrative of what has just happened. How did it happen? The second process that Dr. Niemeyer writes about is a process of accessing the backstory of the relationship in order to restore attachment security and resolve unfinished business. And this phase is a little trickier, and it does take quite a bit longer even than the first process, constructing the narrative of the loss. This is where I encourage people, whether they have a therapist or not, to really speak out loud about what this loss means to them in their lives and about the person that has been lost and their relationship with that person. What unfinished business is there? What did you not get to say or do with this person? What was left undone? This is how we restore security in our lives and are able to move forward feeling safer into our future. According to Dr. Niemeyer, these two processes that I just mentioned can be achieved through a process of retelling, rebuilding, and reinventing. He calls it the 3R approach. And it's very simple and it's very, very intuitive, but it's not that easy. And again, this is where social support, interaction with people throughout this entire process is essential. So the first R, retelling, involves sharing memories and retelling your loved one's story or shared history. The second R, rebuilding, involves figuring out how to rebuild your life without your loved one and noticing new opportunities. The third part, reinventing, involves learning how to incorporate the love you feel for your loved one into the person you have become as a result of their loss, so that you can now move forward, like I mentioned earlier, not without them, but with them, with a sense of them, a feeling for them, and maybe even being inspired by them throughout the rest of your life. So, if allowed to flourish in a natural way, the 3 R's can lead us to integrated grief, which is essentially is natural, healthy grieving.
I imagine that this process, the retelling, reinventing, rebuilding, is something we should be patient with ourselves, that this process takes time. I imagine that the duration of one's grief may morph and be ongoing in one way or another, and to be really patient with ourselves with the entire journey. I appreciate all of your recommendations for coping with grief and loss, and I also appreciate you sharing your story, Dr. Maldonado. Delphi, I'm wondering how our UT Employee Assistance Program can help. I am aware, based on previous conversations and promotions of the UT EAP, that we do provide counseling services to those eligible. Could you expand on that and maybe share with us some other things that could be helpful from the UT EAP during a difficult time in someone's life like this?
Yes. As you're aware, UT Health San Antonio has contracted with UT Health Houston, a lot of the UT sister locations we are the EAP for, where staff and faculty have employee assistant program services, which include mental health counseling, which we have discussed before. And for UT Health San Antonio in particular, all full-time and part-time employees have 5 mental health counseling sessions for each new presenting issue. So, example, for grief and loss, you would get 5 counseling sessions. And let's say anxiety, you could get another 5. Let's say you're having marital conflict, you get another 5. So as long as it's a new issue, you get a new 5. And unfortunately, we could have multiple losses through the year. So grief and loss is the one case where you can get multiple cases if that's the only thing you call in for. If you need long-term counseling, then we, our referrals, especially if you are a UT employee, we have Blue Cross Blue Shield. We will always give you Blue Cross Blue Shield providers, and that way you don't have to tell your story and develop rapport with a new provider. So EAP is short-term assessment and referral. So we give about 3 cases, which is 15 sessions, and if you're needing more than that outside multiple cases of grief and loss, then we'll just ask you to start paying your Blue Cross Blue Shield copay to your provider. The other thing that you would be eligible for all employees following full-time and part-time for UT Health San Antonio is work-life services, where you have legal and financial consultation, assistance with child care and elder care resource referral, and free simple will. And you can either call for that information, and specifically on the will, you can call for the will kit or you can go online. Also through My Life Values, where UT Health San Antonio, you can use username and password, UTEAP. Doesn't matter if it's uppercase or lowercase. And there's tons of webinars that are free access to you 24/7, 365 days a year for you to watch on the topic of grief and loss, and also a lot of articles and handouts that you can find on the My Life Values website. And it would be found under trauma and grief and under monthly webinars as well. And there's a webinar archive library that you have lots of webinars to watch on different topics in case you have sometimes having a hard time falling asleep. I always, when I get those late night calls on the on-call phone, I always direct them there, and that's usually very helpful. So those are some of the things. And to add on other ways to cope with grief and loss that Dr. Maldonado mentioned is there is Grief Share in the churches. If you have experienced a recent loss, and you can go through that curriculum. And there's a great book that you can buy either through Amazon or your local bookstore called the Grief Recovery Workbook. It's a classic one. It has lots of assignments to go through the grief process, and that's always good to do with your therapist or with someone that you share that loss with.
I appreciate that, Delphi. The Grief Share program that you mentioned, is that a way to connect with some social support or support groups?
Mm-hmm. Yes, and it's usually held in the churches.
Perfect.
So
Okay.
if you just Google Grief Share, and they will I'm pretty sure they'll have like locations of where that is found in your area, or how to get connected online, which a lot of people do online nationally now.
Wonderful. Thank you. I imagine that would help with maybe one's tendency towards social isolation during stress and difficult times like these. And I appreciate you mentioned the complete breadth of support provided by our UT Employee Assistance Program, including legal and financial. Sometimes the downstream of losing a loved one are, legal and financial implications as well. And that's something that, we often don't talk about. So I appreciate you sharing the complete breadth and depth of the UTEAP. I want to thank both of our guests today. This has been incredible, and your personal sharing and your professional expertise has been tremendously helpful. As you heard from our two expert guests today, while grief and loss may be a universal experience, it is also a uniquely individual experience. Dr. Maldonado and Delphi Medina, thank you for making lives better by sharing your well-being wisdom. Please tune in next time for some practical tips to increase work-life harmony and decrease stress, anxiety, and burnout.